Thank you. It is such a great honor to be with all of you. And to be with the viewers who are watching the live stream, as well as to be with the viewers who are watching Alex TV. And we're so excited at Democracy Now! That Alex TV is now broadcasting Democracy Now! Every night, Monday through Friday at 11 p.m., repeated at 8 the next morning. And on Alex Radio, every night also at 11 and repeated the next morning at 9 a.m. So, yes, I'm Amy Goodman, and I am the host of Democracy Now! And we are about to celebrate our 19th anniversary. It's really hard to believe. So I'm going to go back to the beginning, even before Democracy Now! Started. How many of you watch or listen to Democracy Now!? Asking the audience here at Alex TV. Well, we started in 1996 as the only daily election show in public broadcasting in the United States. And we thought it would be a 9-month project and then be over. When I got the call to do Democracy Now!, I was in Haiti. I was in a safe house. You know, in Haiti, people die when they would be gunned down when they went to vote, but they still voted. And I thought about how interesting this was that I was being asked to host this show because in the United States, most people didn't vote. I didn't think it was because of apathy. I was interested to know what people were doing in their own communities. I thought they were just involved in different ways, or maybe they just thought there wasn't really a choice. Why bother? But whatever, I agreed to host the show, and it was a very interesting way to go from state to state where the primaries were. Instead of showing the horse race, you know, who's ahead, who's behind, what do people represent who are running? And what do people on the ground in their communities, what are they doing? And why are they voting or not voting? For example, if you're wondering what happened last week in the United States, we had midterm elections. Some people called it the Republican wave. You know, they took over in many different states and they took over the US Senate. But I think much more interesting is, well, what happens if they threw an election and no one came? The US midterm elections of 2014. Less than a third of people who could have voted, voted. So this doesn't show some rightward shift in the United States. In fact, if you look at issues and ballot initiatives and referenda that were passed in the United States, very interesting things. In some of the, what we call the reddest states, the Republican states, you might refer to red in a different way in Europe, but in the most conservative states, minimum wage was passed. So in places where they voted for Republican senators and governors, still, it didn't just squeak by, you know, increasing the minimum wage in the United States. It passed by 2-to-1, 3-to-1. It meant Republicans, Democrats, Independents, Greens, everyone was voting for it. And I think that's much more interesting to look at. But anyway, back in 1996, we were looking at the elections then. At that time, it was President Clinton who was reelected, and the show was going to end. We were broadcasting, and we were very proud to be broadcasting on 8 stations, 8 community radio stations. We started on Pacifica, and I'll talk about what Pacifica is in a minute. After the election, more stations wanted to air Democracy Now! Than ever. So we continued. And it kept growing and growing. And then the week of September 11th, 2001, the week of the attacks on the World Trade Center, one TV station, coincidentally in New York, a public access station, maybe like Alex TV, had already planned in advance that they wanted to broadcast Democracy Now! So by chance, we started that week, and we were the closest national broadcast to Ground Zero. And once we went on that one television station, emergency programming, TV stations all over the United States asked us to broadcast Democracy Now! We were starting to send them out in FedEx, like DHL, every night, because I thought we shouldn't snail mail them like regular mail, because this was breaking news. And so more and more TV stations started to broadcast Democracy Now! And then when we would broadcast on television, the public radio station in a town would ask, and then the public broadcaster would ask. And now, 19 years later, we're broadcasting on 1,300 public radio and television stations around the United States and around the world. We broadcast in Spanish, our headlines as well. And you can go to our website at democracynow.org. You can watch, listen, and read. We transcribe everything of every hour show. So it's very news heavy. I just came from 2 weeks ago, we broadcast at Octo Television in Vienna, which is perhaps the equivalent of Alex TV in Vienna. And we did their first global broadcast from there. We broadcast every day there. And we just came last week from Norway, from Oslo, from the Norwegian Social Forum. So I originally come from Pacifica Radio, which was founded after World War II. By a war resistor, by a conscientious objector. His name was Lou Hill, and when he came out of the detention camps in California after the war, he said there has to be a media outlet that's not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. And that's how Pacifica was born. Not run by corporations, as George Gerbner would say. He was the late dean of the Annenberg School of Communications at the University of Pennsylvania, founder of the cultural environment movement. He would say, not run by corporations that have nothing to tell and everything to sell that are raising our children today. And so Pacifica was born. KPFA in Berkeley was the first station, went on the air in 1949. KPFK in Los Angeles, 1959. My station in New York, WBAI, went on the air in 1960. You know, it's the one that had the debates between Malcolm X and James Baldwin on the effectiveness of nonviolent civil disobedience. Washington Station, in the power capital of the world, in D.C., went on the air in 1977, and KPFT went on the air in Houston. That's the 5 stations in 1970 in Houston, Texas, the Petro Metro. Very interesting station because it's the only radio station in the United States, this station in Houston, whose transmitter was blown up. It was blown up in 1970, just a few weeks into the operation of KPFT, blown to smithereens. The Ku Klux Klan had strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter. Now, the silver lining, if there was one, was that it's not like Pacifica had money for advertising, so it certainly blew it into the consciousness of the potential listening audience of the people of Houston, sort of like, you know, sort of they started, to say the least, with a bang. And they rebuilt the transmitter, they went back on the air, and the Klan blew it up again. Now, I can't remember if it was the Exalted Cyclops or the Grand Dragon, because I often confuse their titles of the Ku Klux Klan. You know, the hate group in the United States who wear the white sheets and hoods, and the Grand Wizard, the Exalted Cyclops, the Grand Dragon. One of them said it was his proudest act. And I think that's because he understood how dangerous Pacifica is, how dangerous independent media is. Dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it's a Palestinian child or an Israeli peace activist, whether it is an uncle from Iraq or an aunt in Afghanistan, you begin to understand where they're coming from. I didn't say agree with it. I mean, how often do we even agree with our family members? But you understand why they're saying what they do. And I really do think that that understanding is the beginning of peace. The media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, it's wielded as a weapon of war. And that has to change. It's why we have to take the media back. So I want to go back to right before the invasion of Iraq. And it's also why it's nice to come here to old Europe. Is that what Donald Rumsfeld called you, right? Germany and France, the countries who were opposed to war, he wanted to frame it as old thinking. I think it is much more difficult to wage peace than it is to wage war. And it's what we all have to learn to do. And the place to have these discussions about these very tough issues, how you solve critical crises diplomatically, is in the media. It's most important right here and all over the world, because how do you learn about other places? You learn about it if your family comes from somewhere else or you have a friend who comes from somewhere else, but more often than not, you're learning about it through the media. And it's critical that we learn about the rest of the world through something other than a corporate lens, and critical that the rest of the world learns about us through an independent lens as well. So going back to the lead up to the invasion, it was right around February 5th, 2003, like 5-6 weeks before the U.S. invasion of Iraq, when General Colin Powell, the Secretary of State of the United States, gave his push for war at the UN. You may remember it. I mean, this was a general, Secretary of State, who had a lot of credibility because he was dragging his feet on the war. So for him to say that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction was very convincing to many. He would later call it a blot on his career. I mean, this was the nail in the coffin for so many. Oh, okay. Okay, this is a multimedia speech, and so I am going to be typing at the same time I'm speaking. Wait, tell me your name, because I just came in. I can do it. I just want to say, you wanted me to send an email to your friend, you said? Oh, no, you said to put on Democracy Now! I'd be happy to do that, too. Okay, now you can see how well I can type Oh, my gosh. Do you guys have a different keyboard than we do in the United States? Oh, boy. Okay, this is a challenge. Okay, most of the letters are right, but you got a few ones that are in the wrong place. Okay, let's see. Ah, nice. That's a good idea. Okay, I can even, Gustav's calling. Should I answer? What? Okay. What should I tell him? I could say anything, right? Just tell me whether to say yes or no. Okay, no, I'm kidding. Okay. All right, so what I could do right now is play for you Russell Brand, who was the person we interviewed yesterday in our studio. Well, we in order to get to Berlin to give this talk and the talk I gave earlier today to Compact that was happening over at Cosmos, we had to stop. I had to give a talk in New Jersey Thursday night. In order to do the show and make it to Germany, we stopped in London, and Russell Brand, the comedian and the actor, who now is becoming a leading member of the New Left in Britain, came into the studio in the afternoon before he went off to the Royal Albert Theatre to perform. And we had, let's just say, a rip-roaring time for that hour. And then I came to Berlin. But talking about the war and that speech that Colin Powell gave, there's a media watch group in New York called FAIR, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, fair.org. And they did a study of the 2 weeks around Colin Powell giving his push for war at the UN, looked at the 4 major nightly newscasts. In the United States, that was the NBC Nightly News, CBS Evening News, ABC World News Tonight, and the public broadcaster, the PBS NewsHour. In that 2-week period, such a critical time right before the invasion, a few weeks ago, I went to the UN because I had the honor of introducing and then doing a public interview with Noam Chomsky. It was in the UN General Assembly. 800 people packed the hall. It wasn't actually an official meeting of the UN General Assembly, but many ambassadors came, and they had to use this hall because so many people came from around the world to see this. And Noam Chomsky, world-renowned linguist and dissident who's written over 100 books. He talks about the manufacturing of consent, how the media manufactures consent for war. And that's exactly what the media was doing at this time. Because in the United States, in the lead up to the invasion, While you in Germany may have been hearing that the US was all for war, you wouldn't have been stupid if you looked at all the media and said, clearly the American people are just for war. Because they looked at the 2 weeks around that moment, 5 weeks before the invasion, 4 major nightly newscasts, 393 interviews done around war. Guess how many were with anti-war leaders? About half the population was actually opposed to war and half for the war. How many were with peace leaders at this critical juncture? You think half, maybe 150, 200 voices against the war? 3. 3 of almost 400. That is no longer a mainstream media. That's an extreme media beating the drums for war. And that's why we have to take the media back. Because I really do think that those who are concerned about war and peace, those who are concerned about the growing disparity between rich and poor, those who are concerned about climate change, the fate of the planet, are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media. And so we have to change that. Why does it matter? Well, look at how the media behaved at that time, not only beating the drums for war. I mean, we don't have state media in the United States, but you have to ask, if we did, how would it be any different? And so at that time, all these voices for war and the newspapers, the paper of record, the New York Times, front page stories repeated over and over based on unnamed sources, alleging weapons of mass destruction, written by Miller and Gordon. The Times would later, a few years later, do a kind of what they called mea culpa. I would call it a kind of culpa. It was a box on page 810 that said the Times in Iraq, sort of how they got it wrong. They didn't name those reporters, Judith Miller, Michael Gordon, and others. They just said maybe they kind of got it wrong and it wasn't true and they should do better next time. Well, they need that box on the front page of the New York Times as many times as those articles appeared, because that's what sinks into the consciousness of people, not only in the United States, but around the world. And why it matters when the media acts as a conveyor belt for the lies of the administration, because the lies take lives. We know why it matters. Look at Iraq today. Look at Afghanistan today. We are in the longest period of war, of endless war, than we in the United States have ever been in. And it's a war that is now being presided over by President Obama, who rose to power in the United States precisely because he was opposed to the war in Iraq. How is this possible? And yet, I wish I could just be sharing with you a history lesson. 10 years ago, this is what happened, and we should learn for the future. But it's happening again. The U.S. is now waging war again in Iraq, expanding to Syria. And you know who are on the networks pushing for war? The very same voices who got it wrong in 2002 and 3 and 4. When will these networks ever learn? When will they ever learn? Where are the peace activists? Where are the soldiers who are coming home from the longest tours and the most numerous tours of duty, as it's called, in these places? They sometimes serve 4, 5, 6 tours of duty. The level of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is horrifying. Because when you come home with PTSD, as it's estimated a third of the more than 1 million people who have served in these wars, this violence ripples throughout society in so many different ways. In some of these military bases, the killing of wives, for example, has skyrocketed. The violence of people not being able to contain what they're told in civilian society they could never do But then all the bets are off when they go to Iraq and Afghanistan, and then they come home. And then there's just the personal reckoning of what have I done in going abroad to fight a war. We've gotten glimpses of it. For example, these astounding hearings in 2008 just outside Washington, D.C. Democracy Now! Was the only network at the time to broadcast in full these winter soldier hearings, as they were called, soldiers coming back talking about the atrocities they had committed. This all has to be discussed as the U.S. talks about recommitting. You know, President Obama said they're going to strike ISIS, they're going to move out. The range of debate in the U.S. media, if you could call it a range, is do we just bomb or boots on the ground? That's the big discussion. What about not waging war at all? You know, we had a guest on the show the other day. His name was General Daniel Bolger, and he's written a new book about how the U.S. failed the wars, how the U.S. lost the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. He told me, he said, yeah, we in the military, we all watch Democracy Now! It's interesting because it's not about whether you're for or against war. It's that we cover it. We do think that when a country commits to war, there's no more serious decision a country can make, and it's our obligation to show what is happening in these places. But I said, General Bolger, what happens if war were not an option? If war were just off the table? He was quiet for a moment. If that was not a way you could solve a conflict, just think about that. How profound that is. And I also asked him what he felt about these generals who were invited on the networks. This isn't even so much the generals' fault. You know, in the United States, the media's redefined general news, right? It's general news brought to us by the generals. And sometimes you wonder if there is a kernel of truth in them. But I don't know, does that translate into German? I don't know. But because who are the generals who are brought on? They're often referred to as kind of elder statesmen. What is your view? And you know, the fact of the matter is there are many generals who drag their feet on war because they know the realities of war. But those are not the ones that are brought on. They're brought on, they're referred to as a retired general. They're often on the network's payroll to comment, you know, how fast should we move into this war, boots or just bombs? And they are rarely, if ever, in the corporate media identified as working now for weapons manufacturers. This is an absolutely key point, and I don't know if you have the same situation in Germany. But often a retired general is now working for Boeing or McDonnell Douglas for a weapons manufacturer. And you should know that. You should know that they are making their money if there is a war, that they're increasing the profits for the company they work for, but they're not identified in this way. A great Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter named David Barstow at the New York Times has often exposed this story of who they work for and what we are not told. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't have weapons manufacturer spokespeople on, but you should just know who they are so you can take what they're saying with a grain of salt, or you know where they are coming from. And when I asked him if he thought they should be identified, these are his colleagues. He said, yes, and I'm not on the payroll, he said, of any weapons manufacturer. But that's very, very important. We need a media that tells the truth. And speaking of telling the truth, I think it's very interesting to be here and to see some of the campaigns that are being waged. For example, the campaign for Germany to grant Edward Snowden asylum. You know, that's really interesting. Edward Snowden, as you all know, was the young NSA subcontractor who was 29 years old, started to see, as he was working for various subcontractors, that he could not only read the email of the President of the United States, you know, this 29-year-old high school dropout, and he's thinking, why can I read his email? but it was going to a larger issue. And it's interesting because when the pundits were on television, you know, the pundits who you get, these small circle of pundits who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong, you know, calling him a traitor and he should be given the death penalty. We have the death penalty in the United States. Over 3,000 people are on death row in the United States. And I remember seeing one politician saying, I mean, he didn't even graduate from high school. Who does he think he is? And I thought, wow. I mean, isn't this much more a comment on the state? So this young man who didn't graduate from high school can read the email of the president, figured out how to do this, has that ability. That's much more revealing about the state than about Ed Snowden. And maybe also, because of his clear brilliance, I don't think anyone would dispute that, a comment about the problem with public education in the United States, that he would have to leave. But so he starts to see some things that horrify him. And he thinks, how can I get this information out? He said he's not a social activist, but he did feel that the American people should make the decision themselves. You know, information is very important, and that we in the United States should decide how we want our state to conduct itself. Do we want to be a national surveillance state? Because, of course, it wasn't only the President of the United States email that he could read, but anyone else's as well. So he decides he'll reveal this and can't do it in the United States, so he flies to Hong Kong. To show how brave Edward Snowden was, when was he making this decision? He was making it in the midst of the trial of Chelsea Manning, at the time, Bradley Manning. That's the young intelligence officer who went to Iraq and uploaded untold number of documents, logs from Afghanistan, Iraq. It's amazing, you know, onto a CD in the desert in Iraq. He could get all of this information, Iraq war logs, Afghan war logs, they're written by officers, by soldiers, State Department cables going back decades. And he was charged, at the time, he was charged with giving them to WikiLeaks. And I'll talk about Julian Assange in a second. So once he was taken in Iraq and then brought to Kuwait and then to Quantico in the United States and held in solitary for so many months, UN rapporteur on torture saying this is unacceptable. You know, they were breaking him down as a human being, stripped naked. We could not hear his voice for over 3 years. Democracy Now! Broadcast his voice in trial, but it was muffled. It was a surreptitious recording. So here was Snowden seeing if he were to release this information, well, could he even do it? So he leaves the country, goes to Hong Kong, and he meets with a very, very brave, now Berlin resident, Laura Poitras, and Glenn Greenwald, who are risking everything, as he is, to meet with him, get the documents, and through the series of revelations and articles they wrote for The Guardian and The Washington Post, they reveal what he has found. At first, the administration is saying this is absolutely a lie. President Obama says he did not have anything to do with launching a discussion about surveillance. Edward Snowden didn't. And that it wasn't true. Of course, he couldn't read his email, but then he released the documents. And I think the Obama administration encourages the getting of documents and releasing them, because unless the documents are released, then it was only then that the administration had to back off and say it was true. When I was going in to see Julian Assange a few months ago to do an interview, and I encourage everyone to go to democracynow.org to see this interview. It was really interesting. But now you can watch every night on Alex TV, and you'll get to see these interviews as they happen. But as we were going into the Ecuadorian embassy in London, remember Julian Assange is holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy. He's been granted political asylum in Ecuador. He's wanted by Sweden, not on charges. He hasn't been charged, for questioning around 2 cases around sexual misconduct. But I think it's extremely important people understand, and I take any kind of charge like that very, very seriously. But it's very important for people to understand that they don't seem to have the evidence in Sweden even to charge. Charging doesn't mean you're guilty. It means you have to go to trial. But they haven't even, the level of questioning hasn't even risen to a charge. And yet he has been in the Ecuadorian embassy for 3 years. He says he would go to Sweden in a heartbeat. He has invited officials in, prosecutor, come in to the embassy, and he'll answer their questions. He was available for questioning before he went in and when he was in Sweden. He says, I'll answer the questions. What he is afraid of if he's extradited to Sweden is that he will then be extradited to the United States. And why is he afraid of being extradited to the United States? Well, think about Chelsea Manning, in prison now for decades. Think about what Edward Snowden faces right now. So Edward Snowden went to Hong Kong, released the information to Laura and Glenn. Laura, by the way, I assume, how many of you have seen her new film, Citizen 4? That's how Edward Snowden identified himself to her, and I encourage everyone to see it, and to the audience who is watching now on Alex TV and the live stream, wherever you are in the world, Citizen 4 must be on your must-see list. See the film they don't want you to see. It's the story of Edward Snowden. And Laura's here because she felt she could not edit her film in the United States, afraid it would be taken away. And she had reasonable grounds for that over these years. She's done remarkable films on Guantanamo, on Yemen, on Iraq. And over the years, she has been held dozens of times at U.S. airports, going in and out, questioned, her computers taken. Very serious reasons to be concerned. So they did this film, she did this film, Citizen 4, about what happened when Edward Snowden went there. And now this is where Julian Assange comes in. Julian Assange and another Berlin resident, Sarah Harrison, who is a crusading WikiLeaks editor who flew to Hong Kong to help Edward Snowden get out. Amazing to think that here you have WikiLeaks that is wanted by the most powerful country on earth, the United States. He is holed up in this tiny room. He hasn't seen natural daylight. I mean, even prisoners get to walk in a yard for over 3 years, because if he steps outside, they will arrest him. And here he is able to help Edward Snowden get out of Hong Kong, facilitate a ticket. So he makes his way. I mean, Edward Snowden was going to be granted political asylum in Latin America. That's all where he wanted to go. But as soon as he started flying, they pulled the passport. Now, the U.S. government. Now, you may all know this, but most people in the United States don't, because immediately the media, and I include journalists in this, it's not just the political pundits, are in the media saying, you know, what did he want to do? What was he doing this for? Was he a Russian spy? Immediately goes to Russia. It's not where he wanted to go. He was transiting through the airport heading on to Latin America, but once your passport is pulled, you can't go anywhere. So once he lands in Russia, he can't leave. He's with Sarah Harrison. They are there at the airport for something like 5 weeks, and then he's granted political asylum, and that is where he is until this day. Sarah Harrison also spending months there with him until she ultimately left and is here. And what she risked, I mean, she is not a German citizen. She wants to go home to Britain, but she's afraid that she too could be arrested. You know what happened to Glenn Greenwald's partner, David Miranda, when he was coming from, I think it was Berlin, and making his way back home to Brazil, where Glenn Greenwald lives. By the way, Laura and Glenn both won the Pulitzer Prize for their reporting. So David Miranda at Heathrow Airport is held for, a second under 9 hours, and held under terrorism laws in Britain. These nomads of the digital age, think about all they are risking. So when I went into the embassy to interview Julian a few months ago, at that time, Hillary Clinton was interviewed by the Guardian newspaper. And she said, I don't know why Edward Snowden doesn't come home. he could launch a vigorous legal and public defense of himself. Really? Is that what Bradley Manning, now Chelsea Manning, could do before her trial? Launch a vigorous public defense? You could not hear this person. They know this isn't true. They also said, and Hillary Clinton said, senators have been saying this for a long time. There's nothing new here. Really, there's nothing new. In fact, there were senators. There are Senator Wyden of Oregon, Senator Mark Udall of Colorado on the Senate Intelligence Committee, who've been sort of sounding the alarm, saying, Americans, there's something terrible going on here. You have to know what your state is doing, but we cannot tell you. Our lips are sealed. We're on the Intelligence Committee. Udall was just defeated by a Republican in Colorado, so the one who is even just sounding the bell cannot sound it anymore, won't have access to that information. They themselves said they can't tell the American people. But here is Hillary Clinton, who may run for president, who may become the next president of the United States, saying, I don't know what Snowden's problem is. He could come home and vigorously defend himself. These are very serious times, and these allegations, you know well, the documents, what they told, for example, about Germany, spying on Angela Merkel even before she was chancellor, not to mention all of you, not to mention all of us in the United States. What do we want to be? What kind of state do we want? What kind of power do we want to give to the state? Why is privacy so important? The pundits on television are so fond of saying young people don't give a darn about privacy. They don't care at all. Look, they're saying everything on Facebook. They're telling everything about their lives. This is not their issue. Interestingly, we had a woman on who wrote a book about privacy who said, okay, say to kids, if you said, do you care if the government reads? Like her kids are like 9 and 7 or something. Do you care if the government reads? They don't really care. It's so abstract. And she says, do you care if I read everything? Oh, no, they say. And so it's a matter of understanding who's reading, who's watching. And when Glenn finally came back into the United States, Greenwald, he didn't come back for almost a year. He was concerned he would be arrested if he came. He's a U.S. citizen if he came back into the United States. But he did with Laura Poitras. They flew from Berlin when they were coming to receive the George Polk Award in New York. Now, it was interesting. It was also 3 days before the Pulitzer Prizes were given out, which they got. It would just be harder, I think, for them to fly into JFK Airport and on their way to getting this award be arrested under the Obama administration's Justice Department. So it's probably a pretty smart time to come in. No one knew if they'd make it to the award ceremony, but they did, and they got their awards, some of the highest in journalism. But then Glenn came back and was speaking at Carnegie Hall, this place of great cultural magic. Carnegie Hall has such an incredible history. And as he was speaking there, he talked about the studies that show when a population is surveilled and they know it, if a population is monitored, they tend to shut down, right? When you know you're being spied on, and it's appropriate to be here, to be having this conversation going back decades, but if you know you're being spied on, it dampens creativity. You're afraid. You shut down. And, these are also inside yourself, the places where dissent comes from. This is a threat to everyone because ultimately, I think it's dissent that will save us. And we have to ensure that people can safely express dissent. So Edward Snowden, Julian Assange, Chelsea Manning, Sarah Harrison, Laura Poitras, Glenn Greenwald, so important to bring us information. And I wanted to go back in time because what it's critical to have also is a media that covers movements, because it's movements that make history. Now, right after, a quick comment, let's just see how much time I have. A quick comment on President Obama's election in 2008. it was an historic moment, right? The first African-American president, a land with a legacy of slavery, it was astounding. And all of the movements that elected him, the environmental movement and the anti-war movement, civil rights movement, the immigrants' rights movement, the gay and lesbian movement, all of these movements came together and did something that was considered inconceivable. They elected President Obama. And I mean, I think that day in November of 2008, the world heaved a sigh of relief. Whatever your political persuasion, people had felt they had hit their heads against a brick wall for so long. And that wall now became a door, and the door opened a crack. But the question was, would it be kicked open or slammed shut? And that's not up to the person in the White House. Okay, he's the most powerful person on earth. But it's up to larger society making demands. I mean, when those who are used to having the ear of the most powerful person on earth whisper their demands in his ear in the Oval Office, if he can't point out the window and say, if I do that, they will storm the Bastille, if no one's out there, he's in huge trouble. That's when he agrees with you. What if he disagrees with you? What role do you play? I mean, you know that Obama was a community organizer before he went into electoral politics in Chicago. What happens when the community organizer-in-chief becomes the commander-in-chief? Who becomes the community organizer then? The good thing that happened in November of 2008 is all these parents throughout the United States, maybe around the world, said to their kids, maybe you can be a community organizer too, to their kids. But what kind of pressure will be brought? And what has happened in these 6 years? President Obama immediately, when he was inaugurated, one of his first executive orders is we're going to close Guantanamo in a year. It's still open. More than 150 men still languish there. More than half of them completely cleared. Many of them held for more than a decade. So many of them have never been charged. What was it, a week ago, 2 weeks ago, a man from Kuwait was finally released, which is extremely rare, from Guantanamo. He'd been held for 13 years without charge. What are we saying to the rest of the world? What model are we presenting? The horror when we see ISIS, a member of ISIS, standing over a prisoner or a journalist in an orange jumpsuit. What does that jumpsuit mean? Everyone knows that it's hearkening back to Guantanamo. What example are we setting? And I dare say it's not what most people in the United States feel, despite what our media says. So all of these movements elected President Obama. And you might say, what happened? I mean, the immigrant rights movement, President Obama has presided over more deportations than any president in U.S. history. He's passed the 2 million mark. I mean, all these groups that supported him, the establishment groups in Washington, have most recently started calling him the deporter-in-chief. And you know it has stung him. He considered this a base of his support. But you also see what happens when people organize. Young people, they call them dreamers. They call themselves dreamers. They sit on the campaign offices of President Obama, of Congress members, and they risk deportation. Not just the rest of us. If we engage in civil disobedience, you risk arrest. They risk arrest and deportation, and yet they're doing it. They're exposing themselves. They're saying, I am undocumented. The bravery in doing this is so important. And you see the pressure it's brought on him. First, he passed an executive order responding to this particular movement, saying, okay, you particular dreamers, you can stay, you can go to school, you can work, a subset of undocumented immigrants. So I was covering the Democratic Convention in Charlotte a few years ago. The first arrests, the first day of the convention, were immigrants outside. It was pouring rain right outside the Democratic Convention. They had gathered and were holding banners that had butterflies all over them. And a group of them sat down, and one of them was a young woman with her arm around an older woman. I assumed it was her mother. And I said to her, well, why are you getting arrested? I bet you could qualify under the Dreamer Act. And she said, but my mother can't. So what use is it for me not to be deported if my mother is? And another young woman who was getting arrested, putting her head down on her knees, knowing she was about to be taken away. I said to her, these banners all have butterflies on them. Why butterflies? They were holding banners also that said, "No papers, no fear. No papers, no fear." That's what they were chanting as well. And I said, "Why the butterflies?" And she said, "Oh, because butterflies know no borders. Butterflies are free." These are the movements that make our countries great. So they're the first to get arrested at the Democratic Convention, which renominates President Obama to a second term. And so he is seriously stung, and he first issued an executive order to protect the Dreamers, some of them. And now, once the Republicans have taken over the Senate and they have continued to be in control of the House, he says he's going to issue an executive order that could save some 5 million people from deportation. This all comes from enormous pressure and organizing. So right when he was elected and before he took office, Michelle and Barack Obama went to the White House. They were being toured around by the Bushes, and I was invited on CNN to comment. And there were other people in other studios commenting, and all of a sudden I see the Obamas coming to the White House, and it's going, oh my God, and I'm seeing the video, and everyone's jabbering about something or other. And I said, wait a second, we have to take pause. This is an historic moment. Barack Hussein Obama, Michelle LaVaughn Robinson Obama. Michelle Obama is the descendant of slaves, which means their daughters, Malia and Sasha, are the descendants of slaves. They are about to live in the White House, the most famous house on earth, which has been built by slaves. Let's just take pause. And I thought about a house not so far from the White House. It's a couple hours away on the eastern shore of Maryland. The eastern shore of Maryland is where Frederick Douglass was born. You know who Frederick Douglass was, great abolitionist. He was enslaved as a youth and a teenager, and he was taken to this property. He was given to a man named Ed Covey, who was known as a slave breaker, who dealt with the troublesome slaves. It might not surprise you to know Frederick Douglass was a troublesome slave. And he was beaten and he was tortured. He escaped. He headed north. He came to New York. He took refuge in the printing press offices of a man named David Ruggles, who was a free black man born in Connecticut. And I mean, that's just so interesting. Frederick Douglass had the North Star newspaper. He started it. David Ruggles had this printing press. Ida B. Wells, born a slave, a crusading, muckraking journalist who crusaded against lynching. All of these people saw media as their form of emancipation because information is power. That place where Frederick Douglass came and took refuge in New York is now an independent coffee shop that I love, and it has a plaque on it. So that property, Ed Covey's property, where he was taken, the slave breaker's property, was called Mount Misery. That property today is owned by Donald Rumsfeld. He bought it when he was Secretary of Defense around 2003 to be near his close friend Dick Cheney, who lived down the road. This is in a place called, when they were Vice President and Secretary of Defense, in a place called St. Michael's, Maryland. Now, I could not believe. So Donald Rumsfeld owns Mount Misery. It's his vacation home. So I'm reading on the internet, and I'm going, this is incredible. But my colleague Dennis Moynihan and I, Dennis is here today, and we write our column together every week, and our latest is called The Silenced Majority, what I was talking about before, that the majority of people aren't silent, but they're silenced by the corporate media. I thought, okay, we have to head down there. I mean, we're journalists, and it's very important. We must protect the internet. It must be kept open and free. Don't let the private companies privatize it. It's the way we grassroots globalize. But it can also be a global rumor mill, and especially if there are students here, you must check your facts. It's not enough to say I saw it in print on the internet. Double, triple, quadruple check them. And as I was reading everything and doing my research, I knew I had to see with my own eyes. So we went down to St. Michael's, Maryland. I was going to be speaking in D.C. like a couple hours later. We had only minutes to investigate this story. And so we come into town, and I realize, I have no idea where the Secretary of Defense lives. How am I going to find out? And then I see this organic coffee shop ahead of us, and I think they will tell the truth. You can see a theme in my life. So I go inside and I said, excuse me. They said, what would you like? I said, I'd like to know where Secretary Rumsfeld lives. They said, oh yeah, just go out back, go down the road. You'll hit Mount Pleasant Road. Don't go that road, make a right, another right. You'll hit Mount Misery Road, go down the road, and that's where he lives. Okay, so we're on the right track here. So we drive outside. We don't go down Mount Pleasant Road. And we make a right, and we make another right. It seems we couldn't go right enough. But we made our way to the end of the road, and there were the Secret Service vehicles with the black tinted windows, and we knew we'd arrived. So I get out with my little video camera, and I'm zooming in as they're zooming out. And I'm thinking, does Secretary Rumsfeld know the significance of the place where he lives? But sure enough, as I'm zooming in, I see a stake in the ground right by the driveway that says, Mount Misery. So we jump into our car and we're headed down the road. And there's this old ancient church. It's a Sunday morning, a black church. And we stop at the church and folks are having Sunday school in the sanctuary. And I go up to an older woman. I said, oh my gosh, you live in such a historic area. I was wondering if I could have your comment. I mean, here Frederick Douglass was born, the greatest abolitionist our country has ever known. And he was tortured at Mount Misery. And now Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, who's known for torture, owns Mount Misery. And she said, I can't comment right now. We're in church. So from Mount Misery to Mount Hope, I raced. A few months later, I was upstate New York giving a talk and at a university. And at the end of the talk, and I told that story, and this young woman comes up to me, a student. She says, could I take you to Mount Hope Cemetery in Rochester, New York? Tomorrow morning, she said, because that's where Frederick Douglass is buried. I said, oh my God, I'm flying to Denver at like 6 in the morning. I have to give a talk. And she said, I'll meet you at 4. I said, oh my God. It's in the middle of a snowstorm, but okay, with that kind of dedication. So I pull up to the cemetery. She's standing there in her winter coat. She's covered in snow. We walk over to Frederick Douglass's grave. We're wiping the snowflakes off his tombstone. And she said, could you come with me to one other tombstone? I said, oh my God, I'm going to miss. She said, please, okay. So we slosh our way over this immense cemetery, and there is the tombstone of Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony was the great suffragist fighting for women's right to vote in the United States, and she's buried next to her sister. Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass were not just allies, they were friends. I was speaking at another Wesleyan college in Connecticut and told those two stories, and the woman came up to me and she said, and did you go to Susan B. Anthony's house? Because right next to it is a statue, not of a general, but of Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass having tea together. See, Susan B. Anthony was an abolitionist as well as a women's suffragist. And Frederick Douglass was not only the greatest abolitionist, he was a great feminist. He was a deep believer in women's right to vote. He seconded, in the 1848 Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, the call for women to have the right to vote before many women believed they should have the right to vote. The suffrage movement, the women's rights movement, the abolition movement, the civil rights movement. These are the movements that have made our country great. And I'm going to just jump forward, talking of civil rights. I was just speaking in Norway last weekend at the Norwegian Social Forum in Oslo. Do you know that it's the 50th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King giving his Nobel address, receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964? Talking about the millions of African Americans who didn't have the right to vote, how many had their heads bashed in, were killed, were beaten, trying simply to get the right to vote. This is what he talked about in December of 1964. Do you know what's happening in the United States today? In state after state, people are losing the right to vote. You need special kinds of ID. In Texas, do you know that a college ID won't do it? You need to have there's a certain set of IDs, like a gun license, then you can vote. But also it means a poll tax. You can't believe it. But what if you don't have the proper ID? So you have to pay. We outlawed poll taxes long time ago. Supreme Court justices like the great Ruth Bader Ginsburg warning you're going to prevent hundreds of thousands of people from being able to vote. You know, this is 50 years later, but democracy is not something you achieve in one moment. You have to fight for it every day. So, who launched Dr. Martin Luther King? That brings me to my last two stories. A few years ago, Rosa Parks died. Rosa Parks, the great woman who launched the modern-day civil rights movement. December 1st, 1955, African-American woman. She sits down on the bus, as she always did, in Montgomery, Alabama, but she refuses to get up when a white passenger wants to sit down. And in so doing, she launches the modern-day civil rights movement. She's arrested immediately. And a few days later, when she goes to court, December 5th, 1955, the Montgomery Improvement Association holds their meeting to choose someone to lead the bus boycott that will make its way to the Supreme Court, that will end desegregation of the transportation system. And they choose a young minister who just moved into town, Dr. Martin Luther King. Rosa Parks launched Dr. Martin Luther King. Now, when we were heading down to Washington when she died, first African-American woman to lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda, then her body's brought to a Washington church, thousands turn out, Oprah was inside, Cicely Tyson, loudspeakers outside to hear the service. That's where we were, where it's often more interesting to be. And we interviewed a young woman, why did you come out today? Young African-American freshman in college. She said, oh, don't worry. She said, I emailed my professors. I said, I won't be in class today. I'm going to get an education, she wrote. And the story is repeated over, and it's in textbooks, who Rosa Parks is. But when we were headed down to Washington, I was watching CNN, and as they told Rosa Parks' story, they said she was a tired seamstress. She was no troublemaker. That's where they got it wrong. Rosa Parks was a world-class troublemaker. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was the secretary of the local NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. She worked under E.D. Nixon. He came out of radical labor politics. He worked with A. Philip Randolph, the greatest organizer in the United States of the 20th century. He went on to organize the 1963 March on Washington, where Dr. King gave his I Have a Dream speech. He organized it with Bayard Rustin, black pacifists, gay activists in New York. These are the names that people should know, who brought out hundreds of thousands of people. And Rosa Parks had gone to the Highlander Center, which was a place in the South where black and white together had worked to most effectively strategize to change the racist laws. Dr. King was at Highlander Center. Pete Seeger was on Democracy Now! Right before he died, at the amazing age of 94. He was crafting the song, We Shall Overcome, partly at Highlander. And he tells the story when King pulled up and he sang him, We Shall Overcome, and Dr. King pulls away and he says to the guy in the car, hey, that's a catchy tune. It becomes the anthem of the civil rights movement. These are the movements. And so Rosa Parks was a troublemaker. The media denigrates activists, but what can be more noble than dedicating your life to making the world a better place? And to show how brave Rosa was, just go back a few months to the summer of 1955, the summer of Emmett Till. Emmett was 14, African-American boy, lived with his mom in Chicago. His mother, Mamie Till, she wanted him out of the city for the summer, sends him to be with his aunt and uncle and cousins in Money, Mississippi. And he's ripped out of bed by a white mob. And they tortured him and beat him, and he ended up in the Tallahatchie River. When his body was dredged up and sent back to Chicago in a casket, his mother, Mamie, said, I want that casket open for the wake and the funeral. I want the world to see the ravages of racism, the brutality of bigotry. Thousands of people walk by Emmett's casket. Then Jet Magazine and other black publications took photographs of his distended, mutilated head, and they were seared into the history and consciousness of the people of the United States of America. Mamie Till had something very important to teach the press of today. Show the pictures, show the images. Could you imagine if for just 1 week we saw the images of war? Above the fold of every surviving newspaper, a picture of a baby dead on the ground, blown up in a bomb attack in Afghanistan. We knew her name, we knew her family. If in every top news on radio and television, a story about a woman who was killed in a U.S. drone strike in Yemen on her wedding day, and we heard who she was going to marry, what her dreams were. If on everyone's Facebook wall, if every tweet, if every email involved a soldier dead or dying, not only Americans, but we all over the world are compassionate. And I think the world would rise up and say, war is not the answer to conflict in the 21st century. I just want to end by saying that I see what happened then and looking at what's happening in Ferguson as a verdict is about to come down on whether a grand jury will indict the police officer who killed this young man, Mike Brown, 18 years old, unarmed African-American kid on the streets of Ferguson, walking in the middle of the day, in the middle of the road, and an officer stops him to say, get to the side of this rural road in Ferguson, and he ends up dead with at least 6 bullets in his body. Do you know that as the protests welled up in Ferguson, I mean, this just tapped the horror and anger and frustration, not only of Ferguson, but of people all over the United States. You know, the symbol now, hands up, don't shoot, hands up, don't shoot. Police last year in the United States killed well over 400 people, more than a person a day killed in the United States. And then the response to the protest, instead of a horrific apology, like, how did this happen? And the establishment coming out and saying, we will meet with you, we will change things. What was the response? A wholly militarized police department out on the streets. And through this, Americans learned that there are these programs throughout the United States that the Pentagon, being conservationist, is taking the weapons from Iraq and Afghanistan that they used and giving them to police departments, large and small, all over the United States, so that the cops of Ferguson are riding tanks. They've got automatic weapons. The protesters expressing their horror, their sorrow, are tear-gassed. It has taught us so many important lessons. Lessons that let us know if we don't stand together, we will all fall apart. And so it brings me back to here in Germany, to World War II, to the very brave brother and sister named Hans and Sophie Scholl. Hans and Sophie were not Jewish, they were German Christians, but they thought, what could they do in the face of the Nazi atrocity? And they, with their professor and other workers, formed the White Rose Collective. And they thought at least they could put out pamphlets so that Germans would never be able to say we didn't know. And they put out these series of 6 pamphlets. And they had them dropped everywhere, in the middle of the night, in alleyways and marketplaces and schoolyards. And ultimately they were captured. Hans and Sophie, their professor, they were charged, they were tried, they were convicted, and they were beheaded. But that philosophy, on the 4th pamphlet written across it, it said, we will not be silent. That philosophy, that motto, should be the Hippocratic oath of the media today, should be the Hippocratic oath of us all today. We will not be silent. Democracy Now!